Today is Father's Day, okay? And just like Mother's Day, I want to give you a non-message about fathers, okay? Because I didn't give you one about mothers, and I've never done that, I don't think. And why start that tradition today? So what I wanted to do is continue to talk about the church, just really because I believe that if you strengthen the church, you strengthen families. And then when you have strengthened families and strengthened churches, then you have stronger communities and you have stronger cities. And so that's my hope in all of this, is that we would just become strengthened and by the word of the Lord. And through that, I want to talk about giving. And I know that's like, wow, you're crazy, dude. You're going to talk about giving on Father's Day. And so I know that's kind of weird, but I want to do it in a way that I want us to go through the lenses of the New Testament. And I know, like, when preachers sometimes say they want to talk about giving, people get really antsy, and that's because maybe perhaps you've been a part of churches where they were misusing money, or where the preacher was embezzling money, or where just something odd or strange just didn't smell right in the church. And so that always, that leaves a lot of us uneasy when it comes to talking about giving. Just a couple of years ago, Congress was investigating these television preachers, and you had news organizations coming out on the news about different ministries who had golden toilets with these preachers, and they would fly these Lear jets. And I don't know if they're going to make it up to heaven. That's not for me to debate. That's not what this sermon's about, okay? But what I want to do, so what's happened is that the world has become a prophet to the church, and that's a problem. When the world becomes a prophet to the church, we got an issue. And I think that what's happened is that is just a minority of the churches. The ones who are misusing funds, the ones who are manipulating people, the ones who are trying to gain more for their own livelihood, that's just a minority of the churches who are trying to do something with finances. And so what's happened, though, then is that has become a caricature of the church. So we have to deal with it. And so what we need to do, the preachers like myself, who aren't trying to make a living off of the church, all right, let's just be honest. We post our salaries on there, and so you know that we're not trying to make a living off of anything. I drive a 1988 car that's now wrecked, okay, and I'm still driving it, okay, and so so we're not trying to gain more. I'm not trying to bank it and try to get a Learjet or anything like that, although that would be pretty awesome if you just want to know my personal opinion about it. But that's not who we are. And so what we have to do is teach it appropriately, what the Bible really does say about giving, what the Bible really says about finances. And I thought about going Old Testament, but then I was like, well, I'm talking about the church, so why not let's just talk about what it looked like for the early church. And let's see how we could find similarities with Refuge and similarities and see how we can learn from the early church. And so if you think giving is just a Malachi 3:10 thing, then you haven't read your Bible. Giving is not a Malachi 3:10 type of thing. Giving is found throughout the narrative of the early church and had a large part in the explosion of the gospel in the church. And so that's what I want us to do with that. So how I want to do this, we'll go to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and I want us to read a little story time at Refuge Point. And I want us to kind of go through, we're going to walk through 2 chapters. I'm not going to read the whole 2 chapters, so we're not going to be here all day. So, Dad, you calm down. But what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of go through narratively what's going on. And this is just one story of several others that we could have picked out. You'll notice one of these verses that I'm going to read is a very popular verse when it comes to giving. But I hope that when you hear that verse come, that you'll understand it now more in the context of what's going on, okay? 2 Corinthians, I may have said first, I don't know. 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I'm going to read just a few verses, and I've got just a few points, and then I'll be out y'all's way this morning. We want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. During a severe trial brought about brought about by affliction, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. And I can testify that according to their ability, even beyond their ability of their own accord, they begged us earnestly. I hope you guys are really hearing what's going on here. They begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints, and not just as we had hoped. Instead, they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us by God's will. So when we're talking about belonging to a church, when we're talking about getting involved in the church, one thing we have to understand is that the church must turn your offering and your money into ministry. Amen. The church must turn money and offering into ministry. This right here that we just read is an example of the early church. And Paul is using the church of Macedonia here as an example to the Corinthians. He uses them because they have understood how to turn their money into ministry. They have set up as an example. He is using them as an example to the church of Corinthians, to these Corinthians people here. Now, I want you to notice a few things about the Macedonian people. These Macedonians were poor, okay? Now, they weren't like our version of poor. They were what the Bible would describe as rock bottom poor. Now, I would ask you how many of you experience being poor? And I think a lot of us could raise our hand. But who could say they've experienced rock bottom poor? I'm talking about like ramen noodles is like a delicacy. That's like rock bottom poor. Like ramen noodles, like what's that, man? That's like, this is like a 5-star restaurant course here. These people have experienced rock bottom poverty. Let's just be straight with all of us here this morning. Poverty that none of us have ever experienced. And I'll even stretch it even further. Poverty that even this community has never experienced. And so I want you to lean in and like listen to what's going on with the Macedonians here. They are being used as an example of their giving. People who have hit the rock bottom of poverty are being used as an example of their generosity. Now that's pretty crazy. That these people who have absolutely nothing are finding something to give to, listen, to further the gospel and to give to the church. Why? Because they understood that their money should be turned into ministry, and ministry for them was to aid their brothers and sisters who belonged to the church, and ministry for them was to further the gospel. This is how imperative this is for us. And I just love this little story. And it keeps going. I love verse 4. I just went my D on y'all. I'm sorry. I love verse 4, y'all, honey. They begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry of saints. In other words, Paul is saying they begged us for more opportunities to continue to give. Amen. Why? Because they understood that money should be used for ministry. Amen. They understood that everything that they gave was going towards the gospel flourishing out of their tiny little world that they lived in. And the Macedonians got that. And Paul's point is that, you know, if these impoverished churches of Macedonia can give generously, hey, Church of Corinth, you can give a little bit more. Okay. Now, the Corinth people, they weren't experiencing such poverty as the Macedonians were experiencing. So Paul here is telling them, listen, Corinth, I know you guys aren't at rock bottom poverty. You guys ain't giving nothing compared to my brothers and sisters in Macedonia here. Amen. And Paul wasn't begging them. I love that. I love that Paul was not begging them for money. Isn't that interesting? I think so many preachers have forgot that little thing right there. Oh, if you just sow into my ministry. You know what I'm saying? Y'all remember that, don't you? sow into my ministry, give me money. Like they're trying to allure you with their creepy little fingers. And they say that they hear from the Lord, but what they're hearing is those dollar signs because they worship money instead of worshiping God. And so Paul has never had to beg for money. He never had to get up and start a capital campaign or start a campaign to fund his Learjet ministry or to fund his golden toilet ministry. Like Paul didn't have to do that. No, the people who belonged to church were begging Paul for an opportunity to give. Amen. Fundamentally different than what you and I hear. Why? So that ministry could happen. Like this is like stretched throughout. There's examples like of this throughout the New Testament of people giving to further the work of ministry. Acts chapter 2 gives us in verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teachings, to the fellowship of breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. Now, all of the believers were together and had all things in common. Listen to this, y'all. Listen to this offer. They sold their possessions and property, distributing the proceeds to all as any had needed. Every day they were devoting themselves to meeting together in the temple, and they broke bread from house to house. All right, y'all want another one? I'll give y'all another one. Chapter 4, just a couple pages after. Now the entire group of those who believed were in one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but instead they held everything in common. With great power the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord. For there was not a need among any of them, because all those who owned lands or houses sold them, brought the proceeds of what was sold. I don't think this church would last long in America. And then in chapter 11, like I can keep going if y'all want to, but I've got like plenty of these examples. In those days, some prophets came down. Listen to this one. From Jerusalem to Antioch, one of them named Agabus, who stood there and predicted by the Spirit that there would be this massive famine throughout the Roman world. This took place during the reign of Claudius. Each of the disciples, according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brothers and sisters. Why? Because they understood that money should be turned into ministry, and that anytime there was a need, they took that as a ministry opportunity to advance the church and to advance the gospel of Jesus Christ. So Paul here is using the Macedonian church as an example to the Corinthians, who've probably lagging a little bit on what they could be giving here. Ministry should always follow money. It cannot be the reverse. Money should turn into ministry. Ministry should never turn into money. And so, Refuge, we've got to keep doing this, right? Like, this is our job. Like, this is our cue from the early church, that Refuge must always turn what we have, what God has blessed us with, into opportunities of service and ministry. Let me just kind of name a few things that we do here practically, just so you guys know, like, we're not up here, like, nobody is here, and the staff understands that nobody is here to get wealthy. The staff understands that because I have set that precedent. We are not here on the backs of the people here to gain a lot from this. I mean, if that's anybody's motivation, then they'll see their way out the door, because that's not the heart of this church. We will never be a church where leadership and eldership or even staff will gain off of the backs of these people. So, Refuge, we must go ahead and reset this and reset the tone that our money must be used for ministry. And we do that by giving throughout the community. We've made a financial contribution to Point University. That's pretty big what they're doing over there. Because as you can tell, in the summer months, we miss them. Hello? Anybody home? Okay. I'm just making sure. You know, you miss them because, like, you wonder, like, oh, where'd the church go? Oh, we are that church that has a lot of college students, and when they're not here, we notice. Okay? So it's important that we give to the college, because the college has done a lot, not just for our church, but for the churches in our area. We give to New Birth, which has a sub-ministry called Naomi's Home. So Naomi's Home is for women, New Birth is for men, and we give to that church or that ministry. We give to Hope Harbor, which is another incredible ministry for ladies. We give to Frank, which is a missionary right now in Japan. It funnels we funnel money for outreaches that we're kind of in the middle of doing one for the summer called Meals for the Mill. We do another outreach in the summer called our Back to School outreach, where we provide school supplies and backpacks to all the children that need stuff. I mean, I'll keep going. We provide for, we have an in-house food closet. We have an in-house clothes closet. We give when there are needs inside this church. We give when there are needs outside this church. It goes to ministries in this church. It goes to our groups. It goes to our kids' ministry. And on I can go. Because we have an understanding that every dollar that comes into this place must fund ministry. Let me get to my second point. Before I do that, I want to narratively go through what's going on before I reach, there's a light there. Before I reach chapter 2, I'm going to destroy everything. Verse 8, I like what verse 8 says. I am testing the genuineness of your love. Paul is saying that giving can be measured. It can measure the sincerity of your heart. Giving can measure the sincerity of your heart. And again, uses the Macedonians here, these people who are rock bottom poverty, as an example to the church of Corinth. Because we can't do ministry unless we have people bought into the vision of this church. We can't do any of that unless we have people who are sincerely bought into what God is doing here. Now, later on in this chapter, it goes on before I get to chapter 9. But throughout the rest of the section of chapter 8, Paul starts to edify and praise this boy named Titus. Now, Titus is like this beast of a preacher guy, of a leader here. Titus was birthed out of the church of Antioch, was just this incredible example of a church, even for us today. Now, Antioch was just an explosive church, and they had something going on, man. They were a church that was multi-ethnic, and they were growing at the rate that was just incredible. They had elders who weren't just these white dudes, which is like evidence that Christianity is not a white man's religion, contrary to a lot of people's beliefs in our culture today. I mean, Niger here was this African man who was an elder in the church of Antioch. And so Antioch understood how they had to give away people in order to spread the gospel. And one of those men were Titus. And so Paul here is edifying him before the church of Corinth. You know why? Because Titus and some boys had to carry some money. So this is like a cool little collection story of like an offering, right? Like a lot of us just think, well, we'll just give online and it's all cool. Well, they didn't have giving online in those days. Y'all didn't know that? They didn't have Western Union. They didn't have, let me just make a quick deposit from my car to the drive-through at the window. I don't know if anybody still does that anymore, but that's a pretty cool little thing that they got going on there at the bank. And so they didn't have any of that. They didn't even have dollar bills. So notice this, that Titus is carrying this huge collection of money via coins, where there were probably men who were ready to rob this guy. So Titus understood that his life could be in danger. And they weren't carrying Glocks or anything like that because they didn't have that. I mean, you just had to be a manly man to take care of yourself. I don't know about that right there, but you had to be a manly man. Imagine like carrying this bag of coins to the next church to aid what they're doing. So Paul is like saying, hey, I need to go ahead and tell you, Titus is the man, all right? Trust this guy, because you know why? You should never give to a church if you don't trust the leadership of that. Amen. And this is Paul's point to him. Like, Paul is edifying and upbuilding here Titus and some men that he's traveling with, and he's telling him, you can trust this guy here. Okay. Because you should never give to a church if you don't trust the leadership of that church. Now, here's what happens in chapter 2, and you can flip over to chapter 9. Chapter 9, verse 6, here's that popular verse that we all want to quote when we're giving the offering, and so I hope you can get the weight of it and understand the context of what's going on. Paul, after just edifying what Macedonia is doing, Paul, after using them as an example, Paul using Titus and saying, you can trust this guy, he's legit, he come out of the church of Antioch, he is on fire, he's filled with the Holy Spirit. Paul says, finally, this is my whole point to you, O church of Corinth. Listen to what he says. The person who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And the person who sows generously will also reap generously. Each, you should underline that, each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. Here's the second point, and I'm going to be out y'all's way really soon. The church must be dedicated to giving. That in order for ministry to continue in this church, then each of us has to decide in our own heart what we can do to see that happen. Because this can't happen if the church is not dedicated to giving. Now, don't worry, I'm not about to pass around the offering plate again, okay? You already had your opportunity. But each person, there's a couple things that Paul here has concluded his whole appeal by pointing out to the benefits of the Corinthians of what reaping does for one. Now, here's the thing. Reaping, what you reap, I think there's twofold here, but I want to focus on the thing. You reap spiritual blessings. Now, not only do you reap spiritual blessings, but I do believe that you can reap the material blessings as well as what we call the good, the common blessings or God's common grace to each of us. Now, the reason why I feel that you would reap the material blessings is so that you can continue to give those blessings to someone who needs them. It was never a motivation for them to continue to gain more and to hoard more for their own livelihood. So Paul here is telling the church of Corinth that each of you, I know you can all give more than the Macedonians because they've reached rock bottom poverty, but besides that, each of you has to decide in your own heart what I can do to see the gospel continue throughout the region, to see these needs met in your community. Paul says each of you, and you will reap these spiritual blessings. And this is what Paul's biggest point here, the church. He's talking to the church, not just some of us. Not just this section here can give and the rest of you, you know what, that's up to you, I don't care. Now, a lot of us can give up our Dunkin' Donut newfound addiction. Oh, I wish I had some help up in here this morning. Ain't even been open 3 days, and everybody up there like every day. Okay? Okay, you better preach that sermon, sir. We'll get into the 7 deadly sins later. Anyway. Each of us, not some of us, but each of us can do something. Even if that something is small, each of us can do something to contribute to what God is doing here. Now, here's the other thing. Now, skip on over to verse 10 here, and I want to just close this out here in just a minute. I've got 3 closings, Robin, so just take note. Verse 10, I just totally went charismatic on y'all. Verse 10 says this, "Now the one who provides seed for the sower and bread for food will also provide and multiply your seed and increase the harvest of your righteousness. You will be enriched in every way for all generosity," listen to this, "which produces thanksgiving to God through this." And finally, my last point here, that generosity breeds generosity. This is not to be taken solely off of, because of my generosity, I'll gain. This is not to be taken in that context. You've understood the context now of what's going on. But that God will continue to provide to you, listen, church, so that you can continue to be generous. That is the whole point of when God wants to bless you materially, is so that you can continue to provide for others. That was their point. This is Paul's point to them all. And this isn't Paul's gimmick to them. This is Paul identifying that if these broke jokers over there in Macedonia can get it, then surely you people of Corinth can get it. Because now their generosity, because the Macedonians have been generous and they experience what generosity really is like. Now Paul's hope and his motivation in all of this is that it would spur and breed more generosity from the other churches. This is Paul's whole point in all of this, that he's using the Macedonians as an example, so that he's hoping that the motivation behind this would breed more generosity. Why? Because generosity breeds more generosity. Now, I've got just a couple of questions that I want to ask you this morning, and then I'll close one more time, and then at that point, I want to ask you these questions, and I would encourage every one of you to write this down, okay? Write these questions down and just think about it, take it back, and ask yourself that question. Each of us can give something. I want to ask you this first question. Are you giving at your giving potential? Because in order for us to belong to a church, belonging to a church isn't just serving, but belonging to a church means that we're giving to the church. Am I giving at my giving potential? Do I lay my resources before the Lord and think about that church that you get fed from, that you serve at, and your community is at? Am I giving to that? Am I giving at my giving potential? Here's the other question I want to ask you. Is giving a spiritual priority in my life? Think about that. Is giving a spiritual priority in my life? And here's the question. Will I commit? Will we commit to being a regular, generous giver to Refuge Point? Now, we have a lot of things coming up, and I'm just going to read some of this off so that you understand that, I want your motivation to be seen here through the lenses of, this is ministry. You're giving towards ministry. We have these summer outreaches that I've already outlined to you. We have our back-to-school outreach. We need to update, some painting in our kids. If you walked in there, you'll see some ghetto stuff going on back there. We have general cost, and I'm not saying general cost is millions of dollars a week. We're just saying we have, stripped that joker down to as bare as we can. Okay? Of about a church of 170 people. No, it doesn't look like here. More people come to the second service. I always have to throw that out there. But at that church with a church of around the 12,000, 13,000 budget, that should be doable. And we also want to increase what we give out to our community. And the fact that we do all of that, that's pretty significant. When I read that, I kind of felt like Paul. I'm like, look at that church in Macedonia. Look at that church at Refuge. The choker be getting it, boy. Man, they are setting a precedent in their community. They are setting a precedent for all these other churches. And I don't mean this haughty. Maybe I do. That's my own heart. Let the Lord judge me. But for some of these churches that don't do anything, it makes me proud to be the pastor here. Amen. Because I'm like, look at that church in Macedonia over there in downtown West Point. Them jokers ain't got nothing, but they are giving. Jokers are made up of poor college students. We have younger families, and younger families a lot of times, most of the time, 100% of the time, ain't got no money. We have widows. We have people who have age and wisdom, and we are made up of all of these people. Look at that church of Refuge. Sometimes I'm like, hey, other churches, y'all look what that church is doing. Ain't got nothing. I feel when I was reading this, man, it just I don't know, maybe that's hard. I don't know. Just pray for me. Whatever. And I want to draw back to that. Here's Paul again. I want to make this point, and then I'm done. Here is Paul again. If you were here last week, Paul was using the church of Thessalonica, in which the Macedonians were placed. Some of their churches were placed in Thessalonica. Here is Paul again using the church as an example, as a memorial, so that other churches could look at the Macedonians and say, this is how we should operate. There's Paul, yet again, using these churches who are flourishing, yet have nothing, who are doing incredible things for the gospel, yet are limited in their resources. And Paul is drawing everybody back to these little churches of Macedonia. These little churches found in Thessalonica, and saying, I need you to be a little bit more like them. And I just, as I read through this, like this interesting little historical kind of sermon, whatever it is, I kind of read that, and I was thinking through that. I was like, I wonder if Paul were here today, would he be writing about the church of Refuge Point? Would he be saying the same things? Would he be saying, hey, everybody, look at the church of Refuge. They're made up of college students. They're made up of people who are in poverty. They are made up of people who do have stuff. There are people who are influential, yet there are people who are in poverty. They are made up of people who are white. They are made up of people who are black. They are made up of people from all types of background, who are young and who are old. And yet they have set as a marker for their community what it looks like to look like a church, what it looks like to belong to a church. So how about a church? I wonder if we could latch on to that. Let's be a church that belongs local to what God is doing in downtown West Point, Georgia, so that we could be a memorial, so that we could be an example to other churches. And when these other churches are watching us, because they are, they'll say, hey, maybe we should be doing some of the things that they're doing. Let me pray for us this morning.